Welcome back to another episode of the Crime Scene Insiders. I'm one of your hosts, Dion Watson, and I'm joined by my co host, Angela Davies, and we are going to take you back under the barrier tape.
On the Crime Scene Insiders, myself and Dee are joined by James Harris, a senior lecturer in policing at Canterbury Christ Church University and course director for the BSc in criminal investigation. Before moving into academia, James spent over a decade as a detective with the City of London Police, working on major cases including homicides and the London Bridge Fishmongers Hall terror attack. He's also one of the UK's most highly trained interview specialists, now focusing his teaching on investigative interviewing and disclosure. So we're really excited to have you on, James. Welcome to the show. It's really great to have you here. So just to get us started, could you maybe tell us a little about what first drew you into policing?
Yeah, firstly, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. What drew me, I didn't really have a plan. I wasn't somebody who always wanted to be a police officer or anything like that. I did come from a family of police officers. My mum's brother, her sister's husband, and then my grandparents' parents were all in the police. So
that is the whole family nearly.
Yeah, so yeah, I think just my dad and brother didn't. My brother went in the army, ironically, but I was never drawn to it. If anything, actually, that put me off.
Put you off a bit and made you want to run away.
Yeah, and then I got to when I left school, I had a place at university, but I didn't really want to go, and I had a year, sort of like a gap year, and then when I came back, it was sort of like, oh, you've got to do something, and the idea of being like sort of office based or something like that just wasn't appealing. So
yeah.
I initially started as a civilian, like police staff with the city police as a PCSO, and I still didn't have any plans to be a police officer. Like, I know a lot of people did that job to become a police. I didn't. I thought I'd do it for a couple of years and I'd work out exactly what it was I wanted to do. But it wasn't in an office, which was the main thing. And then actually, just the truth of it is there was like the financial crash in sort of 2008. It became really hard to get, a lot of sort of like not graduate schemes, but like school entry level schemes and things like that to companies. They all stopped, and I was thinking, well, what am I going to do? And the police is like a consistent role. You can't be made redundant if you're a police officer. So the Met Police were initially recruiting, and I went for that. Like, boo, hiss, shouldn't join the Met. But then they sort of limited all their numbers, and then they basically said you're never going to start here. Like, you'll be waiting forever. So the city police were recruiting, and they said I could transfer my application across. So I ended up starting as a police officer with the city. So it's the very thing I said I wasn't going to do, I ended up doing. So yeah, there was no being truthful. There was no like calling to it. There was no yearning of public. So I guess there was an idea of public service. Like my family all did some sort of like civil service. So I guess there was an element of service, but certainly wasn't a desire or dream from a young age to be a police officer or anything like that. No.
Yeah. And how did you find being a PCSO?
I think because I didn't want to be a police officer at the time, I didn't mind it. I think a lot of them, the ones struggled who perhaps like they wanted to be a police officer, so they were like constantly almost trying to be one.
Yeah.
I didn't see it that way. I don't agree with the role. I don't. I think they could be called something else, and they could do a role within the community. I think you almost just need more community police officers, really, because there were lots of times you're like, what's the point of us? You can't really do a lot. You don't have a lot of power, but the idea of it, of being like a visible presence in the community, I agree with. But yeah, I think because in that reason, I never really felt like I was trying to prove myself. I wasn't trying to, show that I could be a good police officer. I certainly watched people who sort of did try and do that, and I think they, fell foul of it to a degree. Yeah, I didn't mind it. Like, if I'm honest, it paid me relatively well at a young age, so I was relatively happy in that regard. But yeah, I wouldn't say I loved the work. It was just I had a good group of people. When I did it, we were all relatively of a similar age, so it was almost like being back at school to a large degree. not like in the not in the behavioural sense, but just more like
no.
a group of people similar age. It was good. It was good fun actually. So I didn't actually mind it.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you don't really agree with the role, because I don't agree with it, and for some of the reasons that you were just saying there, that I agree with the visibility and presence needed by police on the streets, but to put officers out that actually have very little powers and can do very little actually seems quite wasteful and ineffective in a lot of instances.
Yeah, I think like the transport police do it better because they almost are like police officers to a degree. They have more power. I think they have more powers because of the bylaws. But for me, it was if you're going to put somebody out on the street, you're going to give them like a uniform, like they're going to wear a stab vest. You're almost saying we're putting you in some sort of like situations where you might encounter conflict. Yet we didn't really have any of the tools to do that. And certainly but then there was lots of good things about it. So like taking crime reports and taking low level reports and statements that freed up police officers to concentrate on things. So I got that side of it, but that wasn't really what the job was for. The job was about in the community, wasn't it? So it was almost like I didn't really know what the job was. So for me, it was like, why don't you just spend the extra money if it's there? It's not a great amount. And actually have these people as police officers and put them in community policing roles, neighbourhood policing. That was my view on it, really.
Yeah, I agree with you. What was it like working for City of London Police? Because it's quite a different force, isn't it? It's quite a small force in comparison to the other 42 around the UK.
Yeah, it's a lot smaller. Yeah, it was at the start. I really sort of loved it. Well, I always quite enjoyed it, but I loved it at the start because there was this feeling of it was very different and it was unique. Just little things like the uniform, the helmet cap, the fact that you were like a police force for a square mile in that sense, and the history of it, and the City of London's quite a unique geographical area anyway. So I sort of loved all of that. It was, as a police officer, sort of like as a response officer, I think it was very different to perhaps experiences of people in a county force or one of the boroughs in the Met. So we didn't have a lot of things like domestics because the residential population was so much smaller. It was tiny. So I guess the experience and exposure of things like that were much less. But then there were things that we dealt with perhaps that others didn't have that experience in. So a lot more things like public order, because around that sort of time when I became a police officer in 2010, it was quite a large period of unrest. You had a lot of demonstration, and obviously you had the riots as well and stuff like that. So I think in London in particular, there's that sort of public order element that perhaps, and demonstrations that perhaps county forces don't have as much. Yeah, that side of it. So it was unique, I think, because it was a small force and because it was at the time used to sort of its own way of working. There were lots of things that you reflect back on and you sort of think it's quite strange ways of working. But overall, it was I thought it was, in terms of policing, a really good police force to work for because it was small. Everyone sort of knew each other, which is good and also bad sometimes. But never struggled with things like opportunities. Never, if you wanted to go for a specific specialism, which I did, you never got held back. You were never stopped. It was well funded, if I'm honest. Never really struggled for things which, when I did later on, I did things like mutual aid to other forces. I was acutely aware that we were quite lucky in that sense. So I think that probably shows some of the issues in policing, really, that you've got a police force that doesn't really struggle, and then another police force, can't even give you a laptop to watch some CCTV on. Yeah, but overall, I don't know whether I would have had as long as I did in policing if I wasn't in the city. I think that's probably a fair thing to say.
Yeah, you think you would have left much sooner had you been in a different force?
I think if I'd have got into the Met as I originally sort of planned to do, I don't know, obviously what ifs, but I'm not sure. I think I was a competent response officer. I don't think I was an amazing response officer. I wasn't, RoboCop but I was probably lucky in that it was Friday and Saturday evening, for example, we could be really, really busy, but generally like Monday to Friday, our calls were relatively, you know, less, things like shoplifters and stuff like that. I think maybe 22-year-old James in a busy borough in London somewhere dealing with domestic after domestic or missing person or mental health incident. I don't know whether James would have said, oh, this is for me, you know. That's probably what I think might have happened.
So how long were you a police officer for in the end?
I think it was about 10 years altogether. I joined in 2010. I left for a while just before COVID, so I'd just done just under 10 years. And then I went to work for a university, and then I decided to go back to policing, which was not a lot of people do.
Once you're out, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, and then I lasted about another, I sort of went back, and I think I stayed for about another 6 or 7 months. And then I was like, actually, yeah, I'm done with this now. And then I came to Christchurch, where I am now. So yeah, I think altogether it's around the 10-year mark.
So you must have seen a lot of crime and different types of scenes within that time.
Yeah, so, you know, the city isn't renowned for multiple homicides and things like that. But yeah, definitely lots of different ones. So when I was a response officer, I remember being first on scene to a stabbing quite early on in my career, you know, discovering the victim, literally getting out of the van and discovering them, and then going to lots of different sort of scenes aside from that. So, you know, the lots of things in nightclubs and bars, and my favourite ones was always like when you arrived, the bar staff are like already cleaning up.
Oh,
Yeah.
And you're like,
that happens quite a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're sort of like, there might be some evidence there, but sure. And then I think I perhaps wasn't confident around scene management when I was a response officer. And when I became a detective, yeah, I remember sort of getting called out to all different crime scenes, you know, from like sudden death, you know, people jumping off really tall buildings. So not like crimes, but obviously you had the scene. You know, we had serious attacks in like the meat market, the famous Smithfield meat market. I remember going to a crime scene there, and obviously all the challenges of like one of the busiest meat markets in the country, if not in Europe. Yeah, all the way through to, you know, murder scenes as well. We worked on several murders, and then obviously the terror attacks that happened. So yeah, definitely quite a few different ones.
Full remit there across the board.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with the city is a small geographical area. Like you don't have the volume as such, but you do have I think the severity often of quite extreme things in terms of, you know, like terror incidents. I think when I was in the MIT, we call it MIT, I think most people call it major crime now, we did have a period where we did have sort of 2 or 3 homicides, manslaughters, murders within quite a relatively short period of time. So for the city, that was quite busy. Obviously, like if I said that to a murder detective, they'd just laugh at me. But you can only police the area that you're allocated. So, but yeah, certainly a lot of different scenes, and I think that's one of the things about being a detective, particularly like in the CID, is that exposure to burglary scenes, robbery scenes, sexual offence scenes, having to have that knowledge of the differences, but obviously you're relying quite heavily on your crime scene managers and things like that.
Yeah. What made you want to transition from police officer to detective then, get into CID?
A couple of things really. I just found uniform work, and it's not a criticism of it, it's just it didn't float my boat. It didn't really motivate me. It's a really difficult job, and it's I actually think it's the most important job in policing is response policing, because even like the murders I worked on that went to the Old Bailey, many of the key elements are in that initial investigation and the actions of officers at the scene. So it's never an underestimation of what they do. But I just found things like walking around London on a Sunday afternoon in a late turn, I was just like, this is just mundane and boring for me. It's not giving me a great deal of satisfaction. And I was always drawn a bit more to investigation and doing things a bit slower. So, you know, I liked to pry my nose into things and ask questions. And as a response officer, you couldn't really do that. You didn't have the time. So
it's fast turnover.
Yeah, and you'd have like a small amount of crimes to investigate, but you know, if you'd be expected to do just the basics to get it quickly dealt with. So I just always wanted to do a bit more, and I had a bit more of an inquisitive mind. So that was why, really. And I sort of I got put on like what we called a prisoner handling team, which I don't think anyone has now, which were to keep response officers out on the street for longer. They'd come in, they'd hand over, like, you arrested somebody for assault, you'd book them into custody, you'd do like a handover, and then you'd give it to the prisoner handling team so that you could go back out. I don't think they exist anymore. So I got put on that quite early on by my response team, and I just quite enjoyed it. So it seemed like a natural thing to then go for the what was called the trainee investigator program at the time. And just it was just an opportunity to do more things in the police. I think that was the best way to describe it as well.
Yeah, put the investigative skills and that inquisitiveness to work and get your teeth into things a bit more.
Yeah, and I also thought, well, if I become a detective, if I don't like it, I can always go back to being a uniform officer. Whereas if I never do the detective stuff, I'm always stuck in the uniform world. So I thought I'd have the best of both worlds and to pick and choose. I knew a special branch detective that had been a dog handler like 2 years before, so you could go in and out, which I thought. I actually say that to people now when they ask me about the police. I say, if you're thinking about becoming a detective, just do it, because then if you don't like it after a couple of years, you've got the whole of police career options available to you. And when you go for promotion, again, you can go for DS roles, you can go for sergeant roles, whereas if you just stay as a uniform, so it's not criticism of it, but just those detective roles are not open to you. So it's just, if you're thinking of it, I always say just go for it.
That's the thing, isn't it, in policing, that you get in as a police officer and you're on the front line and you're a response officer, but actually there's so many different roles open and available to you that you can move around in once in the police. And being a police officer really suits some people, doesn't it? Being that first response really does. Some people love it. But if it doesn't, then there's so much more opportunity beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, there's people I was on response with who joined just before me who are still on the same response team because they love it, and that is great. And you need that experience. But the police, it literally is there's like a LinkedIn board on your intranet, and it's got all the different careers that are available to you.
So do you remember your first major investigation?
As a response officer or like as a detective?
Oh, well, now both.
The first big thing I remember as a police officer was touched on it a bit earlier, but it was a stabbing that took place sort of about 4:00 in the morning, and it was during the Olympics. And I remember that because it was I think it was like a report of a fight, and then when we turned up, you sort of saw an individual who matched the description of someone who'd been involved in it, and then it became quite apparent very quickly that they were the victim, and they had been stabbed. So I remember that was I'd never seen extreme violence before. I grew up in a relatively quiet middle class family, so suddenly you'd been presented with this life-threatening injury of somebody, and from memory I think they're similar sort of age to me as well. And then I just remember sort of it all, they say to you about it all kick in just automatically with your training, and it did. And there was about 5 or 6 of us there, which helped, including one of our sergeants who was he's a qualified medic as well.
That's handy.
Helpful. But I remember it just because it was this was the first time it could have been a homicide, couldn't it? And fortunately it wasn't. But I remember it was the first time. It was really, really, everything's important, but you make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And the major investigation team obviously got involved, who I'd never worked with before. And I always remember it because this was 4:00 in the morning, and we were coming back in for nights the following day at 7. And I remember coming in, and they'd already arrested 5 people for it. And that was the first time I was so I was sort of how have they done that? How have they managed to do that in less than 12 hours?
Short space of time, yeah.
And I think that was the first time I really thought I want to be a detective. I want to work on things like that.
Oh, so that's interesting. So your first major incident as a police officer kind of shaped you and prompted you into moving forward as detective.
Yeah, so it was coming towards the end of my probation. So I was in that position where I could sort of start looking at other jobs within the police. And I think that was the one where I sort of thought, I don't really want to investigate shopliftings and low level crime, but this was obviously, really severe. I thought, yeah, that could be me. So I think that was probably the turning point. I probably already started to think about that was probably the route I'd like to go, but that was the confirmation.
I remember my first call out as a scene investigator where I was solo. So I'd had my shadowing period and then I was let loose on my own. And that was the early hours of the morning, and it was an assault in a pub as well. And when I got there, I thought somebody had just been glassed, but somebody had also been stabbed, and there was blood everywhere. And it was both indoors and outdoors. I was like, come on. When you start panicking, thinking, I don't know where to start. And I was like, calm down, you've got this, you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I
But
think
it is a bit of a shock to the system sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think as well that goes back to one of the great things was about the city police was because it was quite a small force, but it was relatively proportionately well numbered. You never really had to deal with things on your at the time. There was always someone around nearby, and if they weren't, it wouldn't take them very long to get there. So you might be slightly panicking about what you're about to have to deal with, but someone would always come and support you, and like the CID would be down relatively quickly, like a SOCO could be there really quickly. So I always remember that was something I was probably getting grateful for being in the city for, whereas if I was in a rural county area where maybe I've got to wait an hour or so for support, that wouldn't be the same. You've just got to crack on. So I think that was always something as well I was very grateful for.
Good team support makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, not feeling you're isolated and left to deal with it on your own as such. Yeah.
So what about your first major one as a detective then?
I think I did about, I think that's probably did a couple of years just over that in general CID, and then I moved quite quickly into major crime, or we called it MIT at the time. And again, relatively early on, we dealt with treated initially as like a manslaughter. I remember that was a death of a young man. And I think that one probably for me was quite impactful because I'd done my advanced interview training relatively close to that, and I remember the SIO saying, "Well, the suspect's got to be interviewed by a tier 3 interview trained." That was the level advanced, and they looked around the room, and it was like the SIO was like, "Who's tier 3 trained?" And I was like, "Me." So I was leading the interview for that. And I remember that to me it was quite big, obviously, because you're not just interviewing somebody about a relatively minor offence now. You're interviewing somebody about, it was manslaughter, which obviously wasn't, not quite murder, but still incredibly serious.
Yeah.
Taking a life.
Yeah, and obviously you've got the factors in there of, like you say, life sentence. So the consequences are so much higher and the stakes are so much higher. So I remember feeling sort of quite a lot of pressure because before that, as a CID officer, it's your own cases. You're the OIC, you direct the lines of inquiry, you interview a suspect. There's no one telling you what to do. Whereas in MIT, the SIO is saying, "James, I want you to interview it." And then afterwards, you're going to have to come back and update the SIO, update the team. So I remember feeling a lot of like pressure. And the guy who we were interviewing, they weren't a celebrity, but they were sort of like well known in the public sphere to a degree. But so I just remember feeling that additional sort of like pressure as well, of sort of like this wasn't just a low key sort of thing. So yeah, and I was still relatively young as well. That was the other thing. Like in age wise, I was probably only like 25, 26. So
that is quite young, isn't it, to be a detective working on those high profile cases and also major crime cases, but then also taking the lead on interview strategies.
Yeah. And I think just things like that gets thrown in. You sort of you feel competent in your job, but at the same time, you're still a young person at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I think you reflect now on that a little bit. You can't be too harsh on yourself to a degree. Yeah, I remember that was the first time I was like acutely aware of the stakes being raised. But then from that, I think that was a really good thing because actually from then on, we ended up dealing with a couple of We had a murder about a year later, and again, I led the interviews on that, and I felt so much more confident in being that lead interviewer and stuff like that. But yeah, the first time was always a bit anxious.
I'm not surprised.
The first of anything isn't it? And that's, like you say, such high stakes. That must pile on the nerves.
Yeah, you go from like 6 weeks before you interviewing somebody, about a common assault, and then now it's like, no, you're the lead. This is about a manslaughter. It's like someone's died, and you're sort of like, oh, you've had the training, but training doesn't really. It prepares you to a degree in terms of the knowledge, but you've got to go. As you guys know, you've got to go through it. The hands-on, practical element of it is really important.
You learn through experience a lot in these kind of roles, really, don't you? Because nothing's ever to textbook either, the way things go. So you do learn on your feet a lot.
Yeah, and also a lot of training and that. It doesn't replicate the stress and the anxiousness and the worry and the tiredness that you maybe feel. So you've got to factor those things in as well when you're doing it. I've been at work now for 15 hours, or I'm really anxious because this is actually real. I'm interviewing somebody. I've done mock interviews, but this person is actually a real person. They're accused of a crime that could result in them going to prison for a long time. So all of those things are very difficult to replicate in training. So not until you encounter that and you get that experience up, and you can take that with you going forward.
You've gone from being a PCSO that didn't really want to be a police officer to detective sergeant you finished on, didn't you? But also one of the UK's most highly trained interview specialists, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and especially as someone in his first interview he ever did, I think I couldn't even speak. And we arrested somebody for possession with intent to supply. So I was in my training still, but we used to do these phases where you'd be in the classroom for like 10 weeks, then you'd go out for a couple of weeks with a tutor, and then you'd go back to training afterwards. And we were only supposed to be doing traffic stuff. So we were just like putting cars over, and we were only allowed to deal with like minor traffic stuff because that's all we'd really learned. But we found drugs in the car, so obviously we dealt with that. And it sort of spiraled from there. But we handed it over to the CID, but the CID officer said, you've got to come into the interview with me. And I say this to people now, I remember feeling fine in the interview room. They're just such intimidating places. Like there's no windows, and it's just a conversation. But I couldn't speak. I remember the guy, the colleague, turns to me and goes, "Oh, anything you want to say?" And I was like,
no. And, Can I go home now?
Yeah, and he wasn't particularly impressed with me, as you wouldn't be. And then what is ironic is I ended up working with him in the MIT and became really close with him, and that was 2010. So 5 years later, I was the lead interviewer for a murder, and he was my second.
Really?
Yeah. So 5 years
That
earlier,
is
I
ironic.
couldn't speak, and then we were doing that. So I just never really had a plan, and I probably still don't really, but I just sort of saw opportunities, and I was like, I'll have a go at that. And I started quite early on to enjoy interviewing. Despite what had happened, I actually started to quite enjoy it. And again, I just always saw an opportunity. So they said, does anyone want to do the advanced training after you become a detective? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. I'd always been told, if you get offered a course, do a course. So I did that, and I loved it. I loved all the sort of strategy and communication skills. And then they said, about 2 years later, they were looking for somebody to go on a specialist course, how to work with terror suspects. I just started in MIT, and I thought, it was a week's course away, a residential course. I thought someone will snap that up.
Snap it up, yeah.
And 2 days later, they were still haven't had anyone for this. I need to send someone. So I was like, well, I'm tier 3 trained. I'll do it. And they were like, yep, fine, you're off. And it was brilliant. That was the first time I ever encountered academics working with the police.
Yeah.
So we had academics there, advising us around, how to work with people with sociopathic tendencies versus psychopathic. How do you build rapport with somebody? How do you show genuine empathy? And again, there were people from the States there, like the FBI, who I ended up befriending, and that's how I ended up sort of getting to go on a course over there in a few years after that, and I've still stayed in touch with them. And just from there, really, I just sort of I found my like niche really in policing. I just was interested in it. I think I was pretty good at it. And then the next level up from there was to be an interview advisor, which was the highest level where you set strategies for senior investigating officers. So you don't necessarily do the interview, but you would come up with a strategy for the suspect. So, what information are we going to disclose? What information are we not going to disclose? Obviously, all within the realms of what's legal. But then also with like witnesses, how do we deal with 200 witnesses following a critical incident? We've got a vulnerable witness. How are we going to interview them? So you had to become well versed in things like basic human psychology, but also like the law and policy and procedure. And I just really sort of enjoyed that. Yeah, it was amazing how a job I never even really wanted to do. I never planned anything. I think that's why I just sort of went along and I saw something and I'll have a go at that. I'll have a go at that.
That's the thing, isn't it? If you have a go at a number of different things, you'll eventually find the one thing that you're passionate about, that you enjoy. And it sounds absolutely fascinating. And again, really about an area of policing that people don't even think about as a potential career path or prospect.
Yeah, because obviously you think about becoming like a detective, but then even within the realms of being a detective, like as you guys know, you can become a family liaison officer. You can become, like I was, an interview advisor. Some people sort of specialise in like intelligence, like cybercrime, open source. And I think the other good thing with policing is you can make things your own niche. Like if you show an aptitude for it and an interest in it, you can almost build your own sort of little area. And that's sort of what I did with interviewing. I think because the city police was quite small, there wasn't a lot of people sort of leading the interviewing. And because I'd sort of gone on these courses and I'd shown that interest in it and passion for it. I was passionate about it. I still am. Obviously, that influences what I do at the university. So I was able to sort of build an area for myself, which obviously was really good. But the main aim of it was A, I enjoyed it, but also B, to ensure that we were doing things right and helping the police officers and the public, really.
What's it like coming face to face with people who potentially, because they're only suspects at this point, but committed these heinous crimes?
I mean, because I think when you watch like TV representations, that often like the killer, they're like a really interesting character, and so it's almost like it's like scary about them, or the behaviour is quite odd, or something like that. Whereas they're just human beings, in my experience, and they have families, they have the same worries that you probably have, and they find the whole experience quite stressful and upsetting. So it's quite a strange thing to say, but a lot of interviewing is about empathy, and that might sound a strange thing to say when you're talking about somebody who you suspect has committed a heinous crime and ultimately has done. How do you show empathy? Like, but the key thing is empathy isn't about feeling sorry for them. Empathy is about trying to see the world how they see it. So if I were in their shoes right now, how would I feel? So I would always feel, that I had a responsibility to be fair to them, but to try and, because as you said, they're a suspect at this stage. They're not guilty of anything. So we've got to treat them fairly. But how can I do that on a human level? And that's like, hi, my name's James. I know we could say, I'm DC so and so, but I'm James. I'm here to ask you some questions about what's happened. I was able to sort of see that human side, and I remember a lot of some of them, they were similar ages to me, or they might have lived in a similar area, and you sort of think there's a lot we've got in common here. Like, we're obviously you're chosen a very different path in your life that I have, but there's similarities here. So how can I build enough of a relationship that we can have an effective two-way communication? And I think that's really important to understand, that your job as the police, you're not there to judge, you're not there to decide if someone's guilty, you're just there, especially in an interview, to try and get them to tell you what happened. And if that means they confess to it, then fine. If they don't want to talk about it at all and they want to exercise their right to silence, again, that's right. But as long as you've tried at every legal but also morally justifiable level to get them to talk to you, and you treated them well, then at least later no one can say that they weren't given every opportunity and that they were treated fairly. So that was sort of how I reconciled with it.
I like that, James, because we are all just humans at the end of the day. And I think that when we start to dehumanize or see people as less than for whatever reason, I think that's when we start getting a whole heap of problems, like I think we're currently seeing in our culture today. And like you said, these people are suspects. And basically, in this country, the onus is on proving somebody guilty, isn't it? You're not guilty until you're found guilty. And I think it's really easy in policing. And I say this because obviously we weren't police officers, but police staff as crime scene investigators. Sometimes it's quite easy to become a bit cynical, and you see some of the same crap day in, day out, don't you? And so it's quite easy, I think, to become cynical and start making judgments. But I think that's when you've got to catch yourself and try and keep an open mind, because every case and every person that you come across is completely different.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things around that. I remember someone said to me, I can never remember where it was, but I always pass it on to people now, and I say, like, imagine you'd been arrested for a heinous, one of the murder obviously is what we consider one of the worst, but like child sex abuse, for example, which we all accept is up there as one of the worst crimes of society. Imagine you'd been arrested for that, and it was a case of mistaken identity or whatever, and you're sat in that cell waiting to be interviewed, and the cell door opens and the police officer who's going to interview you comes in, and you're taught when to introduce yourself, and you go to shake their hand, and that police officer refuses to shake your hand, for example. That's in the grand scheme, it's a relatively minor thing, but what does that say to you? It says, well, they clearly think I've done this. Like, they don't want to shake my hand because they think I've done it. So even what's the point of me even talking to them? Because in about 5 minutes they're going to tell me how they're independent and they're here. Well, no, they're not, because so it's just little behavioural things like that. Again, and that's probably because, like you say, as a police officer, you deal with things day in, all day, every day. But also they talk about a thing called a tipping point, like the tipping point in policing. Where do they go from a suspect to more than a suspect? Yeah. And often it is that point of the recognised point. A lot of the time is that point of arrest. So it's almost like we wouldn't have arrested them if we didn't think they were guilty. So I think it's a real danger for police and staff. It's like that's when things like tunnel vision and biases can kick in. It's like, well, they must be guilty because we wouldn't have arrested them otherwise. So again, I think that's always just, again, I was a bit alive to that, and even now more so. Probably can't say with certainty that everyone is, because we all have those biases and things. It's just whether we allow them to influence us.
Yeah, it's being conscious of them, isn't it? I think, and I think empathy is so important when working on the front line and dealing with the public.
Yeah, and I always, again, not just with suspects, but also with like witnesses. So I mean, how many witness statements I must have taken in my police career, or like speaking to victims, and we do that all day, every day. But I always say to people is that might be the one time that victim or witness ever has to speak to the police. They're so nervous. They've got no idea what's going to happen. You've done it a million times. But again, how you can show that empathy of taking time to explain things, answer their questions, be empathetic, that might shape their whole perception of the police going forward. Whereas because you do witness statements all day, every day, you just sort of reel off, okay, here, we're going to do this, and they're left thinking, well, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, do I have to go to court? What happens at court? What happens with my statement? So again, it's just about that recognition, like I say, empathy, to see the world how they see it, that this is not the norm for them. It's the norm for you because that's what you do for a living, but it's not the norm for them.
Yeah, it's easy to become complacent, isn't it? Do you approach victims and witnesses in the same way, or do you have different approaches to them when interviewing?
Very similar. I think the way I looked at this, it might seem a strange way, but this was always my perception, was that all victims and suspects are witnesses. Yeah. They all just have a different level of involvement in the crime. So, complainant in sexual offence, for example, they are the reporting, they are telling you what has happened from their perspective. Obviously, they are reporting the crime. The suspect is also, you want to get their account about the crime. It's just obviously you are suspecting they have a different level of involvement in it. So I treated them all from a mindset perspective as the same, in terms of they should all have, and that comes back to that word fairness. So they've all got to have a fair opportunity to give their best evidence. So with victims and witnesses, obviously with things like achieving best evidence and the guidelines there, and that is a level of support and guidance for them, which influences how we interview them. With suspects, obviously, it's slightly different in that you are going to challenge them if necessary. If you think the evidence shows their involvement, obviously you've got things like if they stay silent. So there is a different approach. I fundamentally accept that, but as a principle, they are all witnesses to a crime. They just have different levels of involvement from different angles. But in terms of a victim or a witness, they're still the same. Again, for me, it's about what are they expecting from the police, and if it's not even the police, if it's, you can talk about workplace investigation, it's still the same thing. Is a lot of their key questions are going to be around like, what is the process? I think the number one question was always like, am I going to have to go to court? And that was always like probably at the forefront of a lot of victims and witnesses' mind, and it was, how are you going to deal with that? But it was really about that approach of, like I say, getting them in the best position where they are going to be able to tell you what happened. And that might not be immediately. So it might be, like, go away and come back tomorrow. Yeah, I accept that in a day's time, memory might depreciate a little bit, but that was the right thing to do from a welfare perspective. But trying to use those, strategies around sort of like memory assistance, so things like the cognitive interview, for example, was a real tool that you'd use with victims and witnesses, but no real difference in terms of like who they are. Just obviously with the victim, they've got certain rights under the Victims Code, for example, that witnesses don't have. But fundamentally, in terms of techniques to gather information, no, they wouldn't be too different. And again, that same with suspects. I have used a cognitive interview on a suspect who was cooperative to try and identify where they'd disposed of a weapon, for example. Yeah. So you can use any of these techniques on cooperative people, whether they're a victim, witness, or a suspect.
Now, can I ask, how frustrating is it when somebody just no comment?
I would say early on in my career, like, it drove me mad and I'd get really annoyed. And then I think as I became more knowledgeable or experienced, I realised actually they were giving us a bit of a gift sometimes, because some of the, you're only asking. So, for example, where were you? No comment. Were you involved? No comment. Do you know the victim? No comment. Like, these are just fundamental, basic questions. There's nothing really there trying to trip them up. So when it comes to court later and you see like the barrister saying to them, you're telling the courtroom now that you didn't commit this crime because you weren't there. Well, 2 hours after the alleged incident, DC Harris asked you where you were and you said no comment. Like, why have you decided to answer that question today, but you didn't at the time? There's nothing. And when you see it live in court and you can sort of see their reactions to it, you realise actually no comment. There's a reason why people go no comment, and there's lots of defence strategies for it. But sometimes you just think it's a bit of a gift, really. That's absolutely fine. I'm just going to go through what I need to do. But again, I think that comes with the confidence. I think inexperienced interviewers are not very confident. They get really thrown by a no comment, and they just get like a bit of paper and they like rattle through these questions. Whereas really you should treat it as, okay, fine, I've still got these questions I'm going to ask you. I know you're going to answer them no comment, but I'm not going to speed this up. I'm not going to, miss anything out. So, yeah, I wasn't ever that bothered, really, because, again, I think it came back to the fact I didn't think the whole purpose of the interview was a confession. I think if you thought it was a confession orientated, then you would get, but that leads you down a whole rabbit hole of dangers. If you're only seeking a confession, comes back to that whole sort of like tunnel vision. And, that's probably where you start seeing false confessions occurring, because the interviewer is just set on getting a confession from that person. So I didn't find it frustrating. I think early on I probably did, but by the end I think what I probably thought more was, you really should be saying something.
Yeah.
Like, you really
not doing yourself any favours.
Yeah, like, you've had legal advice, I respect it, but you really need to say something. And I've certainly worked on cases where their failure to say something meant that they were probably charged. Whereas if they'd have said something, we would have probably struggled to show that that wasn't the case. Whereas, because a no comment interview was sort of treated a little bit, it wasn't an admission of a guilt, but it was treated a little bit as like, well, they haven't said they didn't do it. So generally you might take that forward for a charge. So yeah, I would say there's a lot of people who, I think, and you can see it's all publicly available. There's like guidance from the Law Society about why you might say no comment, and it's to protect them and to stop them saying something incriminating, or if you're concerned they won't stand up to police questioning because of things like vulnerabilities. But sometimes I've thought, you really should be saying something. So I'm almost frustrated for them, not frustrated at them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So earlier on, you mentioned about perceptions based off TV, things people have seen on the TV. Is there any misconceptions from TV shows or films that you've seen that either really frustrated you or that you thought were quite humorous?
I always think the Line of Duty where they interview suspects in a glass room in an office.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting one that then armed police officers can smash, shoot down and they escape from. I always thought that was quite an interesting one. I don't know if they frustrated me, I guess, because if you did a procedural show on the realities of a police investigation, it might be quite dull, like James is still waiting 3 weeks for his results on his, application for this. And sometimes, though, I think the perceptions of like times are quite like you get like lab results back really quickly, or like, we can turn this around in 24 hours. I know you can expedite things, but that's like for the rarest of cases. I think in an investigation sort of one, it's the one that always just makes me laugh is and this isn't a criticism of SIOs, but SIOs don't do any of the investigative work. They direct the investigation, but the day-to-day actions of it, interviewing people and, interviewing suspects, gathering evidence, that's done by the DSs and the DCs. Yeah, if you watch some of these shows, you've got like the DCI and the DI running around in a car doing all the work, and you're sort of like, that just does not happen. And that's not a criticism of it, that's just not what the reality is. So I think there's this sort of myth that they do a lot of the work when they don't. And just a lot from a purely, I find it so strange, is the silent witness.
Yeah.
The fact that you've got these pathologists running around investigating crime.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? Years ago, when Amanda Burton was the lead, I used to quite enjoy it. I did recognise then that it was ridiculous, but I think it's got even more ridiculous.
Yeah, like I don't mind. It doesn't bother me because it's just for TV. But like you've got two main characters now, and they work for a private company that does sort of forensic work. Yet they're running around interviewing like witnesses and like suspects, and you just sort of think there's no concept of reality here, like whatsoever.
Yeah.
At least like in the, you've got the DCI because you want to have that mythical sort of like sleuth detective who's investigating the crime. I get that, but that literally doesn't happen. Like silent witness, that is so far removed from what would happen. I mean, they'd probably get in trouble themselves for like sort of mucking around with a police investigation or something like that.
They would, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't like ring up the pathologist and say, "Can you just come with me to interview a witness?"
No.
And I imagine the pathologist would say no because they prefer them dead.
Yeah, it's not really in my job. It's not really in my job description. Yeah. I didn't watch them when I was in the police. I never really watched them, but since I've left, I quite enjoy some of the American ones. I think they're just like light-hearted ones. I quite like them, but I still don't really watch like UK ones, to be honest.
Yeah. The drama of it's interesting, isn't it? But when you start looking at the realities, like when we're not allowed to watch CSI related ones now, we'll just be like, oh no, why would you do that?
It must be worse for you for that world, like seeing them do things. You think, no, we wouldn't do that.
Never happen.
So frustrating at times. Do you think, because obviously you went into academia now, do you think that media perception has an impact on the students coming through? Because in the CSI world, it does have an impact when students come. They're very mixed about what a forensic scientist's role is to a CSI. Do you have any of that within policing as well?
I don't know about the role of a police officer, or a lot of my students might not even want to join the police. Some of them will, but for a lot of them, they just love the subject. And I think where it probably influences them a little bit is they love like true crime, So that's probably what sparked their interest in the subject.
We'll have to tell them to listen to this, James.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, they love true crime. They might like watching like CSI or something like that, but it wouldn't necessarily be the case of that they therefore think that's what the role is like. But it probably, one of our jobs is to sort of harness that interest and passion for it, but to get them away from, just being able to tell me, for example, like what happened in this particular murder, as a story, and say to them, right now, look, you're interested in it. I know you're really passionate about, and you're really interested in all the different aspects of it, but I need you to go a bit further now and look at it critically. So can you tell me, for example, like why the police officers might have made those decisions that they did? So going back to things like biases, like, you love watching TV shows where they interview the suspects. A big one is always the Netflix show, I think, Now They See Us, about they were the Central Park Five, I think they were called. They were falsely accused of a rape back in the 70s.
Not seen that.
And the police basically bullied them into confessing to this rape that they didn't actually commit. And it was quite famous because like Donald Trump at the time put like headlines out in the newspaper about them. But that's great. I love the fact they've watched that. But what I want them to do is go, right, okay, these young lads confessed to this crime. So you should now be able to say to like your parents or whoever, like, yeah, like they confess, these are the facts, but also this is how they did it. This is the psychology, for example, of why people might be more likely to make a confession falsely than others, the vulnerabilities, for example. So it's not a challenge insofar as realities of the role. It's more about trying to transfer or build upon that passion and interest and get them from sort of storytellers to actually being able to explain it to somebody. And that's sort of and you know what, it's great when you see them do it, because they can now say, oh yeah, I understand that, and I can tell you why that happened, not just how it happened. That's probably the challenge that we have.
I think that we've dug deep on your interviewing career, which is really important and also fascinating. But can I take you back to the London Bridge Fishmongers Hall terror attack, and you worked in that? Would you be happy to talk us through that?
Bits of it, yeah. Just want me to talk you through it, or? So
your experience?
It happened, was it 2009? There was a terrorist attack that started in a place called Fishmongers Hall, which is on London Bridge, which is in the city. And it was ironically an event it was an organisation, I can't remember what they were called, but they showcased effectively the power of rehabilitation of prisoners.
Okay.
And ironically, sadly, tragically ironic, the sort of man who carried out the attack was there as sort of an example, supposedly, of the power of this program. And obviously, he then went on to murder 2 people before he was killed by the police as he ran out onto the bridge. And there were so many examples of like bravery that day of people fighting him off, both from a civilian and police perspective. So my involvement in it wasn't as an immediate first responder. I was actually in the police station. I was in the training team at the time. I remember it all happened. And obviously all terrorist investigations are led by the Met Police in London. So even though it was in the city, but my role in it was as an interview advisor to advise our senior investigating officer, how best to capture all of the evidence from them to share with the Metropolitan Police. I was strictly around the interviewing side of it, which is where sort of my expertise was around. So
interviewing and strategy.
Yeah, goes back to that sort of what I said at the beginning, really. Like you sort of have those moments where you've not trained for things, but you've had I was an interview advisor. I was trained to manage sort of large scale incidents. What are you going to do if you have a large number of witnesses, for an example? But this was suddenly like, not just murder, but we're talking like a terrorist incident, which is obviously on the grandest of scales, I would say, in terms of a police response. So I think in terms of stress and anxiety as an interview advisor, but I do remember with that just feeling very calm about it all and having a structure of knowing what I was going to do, and I had a particular plan of how I was going to deal with it, and feeling quite calm and relaxed. And again, I think that came a lot of that of the experience that I'd had by that point. Even though it was a a terrorist incident. I'd never dealt with anything like that before, but there was that sort of training, but also the experience and the confidence. Now I've been a police officer for quite a relatively long time. I felt relatively comfortable dealing with it, but obviously you do have that trauma to a degree. Like, you're surrounded by trauma and you're hearing things and you're sort of seeing things and you're aware of things that the public aren't aware of. And yeah, it was a really challenging time. And I think the big thing with that was, remembering that police officers are humans.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're not robots who like walk towards danger. Like, they run towards danger, but then they have to deal with the consequences of that afterwards. And that was a big part of our role as well, was sort of working with the support side of it, interviewing, speaking to these officers, getting their accounts, but also then making sure there was support for them as well.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? Because it's that fight or flight response, and usually officers have that fight response, and that's why they can run into it. But there is a lot of trauma associated at the same time, and we are all, again, only human, aren't we?
Yeah, and also the other thing as well is it's not just those who directly witness things, but also, it's like secondary trauma. So if you're constantly hearing accounts of traumatic incidents as an interviewer, for example, like, that's probably eventually going to have an impact on you as well. So it was a big part of what I was doing, was around that sort of welfare side of it as well. Like, not just saying to people, just write down what happened, put it in a statement and go home. It was about actually supporting people as well. Yeah, that was one of the last things I did in the police before I left the first time. So it was quite a nice thing to go out on, to a degree, like knowing that you'd done something of sort of like a national significance as such.
Yeah, going out with a bang for sure. The big one to go out on, isn't it?
Yeah, so, yeah.
Was your mental health ever impacted throughout your service?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I remember when I started in the police, like, even though it wasn't the dark ages, it was like 2007. But I do remember there was a sort of unwritten rule / culture that you didn't really reveal anything. I think it would be a sign of weakness. Not that, I don't think you would have been thrown out or anything, but you would have almost like, oh, you couldn't do this job then. If you've revealed a weakness, you can't do this, you were almost encouraged to probably not encouraged, but there was almost an unwritten rule, just keep it to yourself. But I remember, I was in major crime. I think we just dealt with quite a lot of things at once. I was dealing with a couple of, even though it was like a team effort, I had about 3 cases that I was the OIC on. I was in charge of them. They were all very different. Like, one was related to traffic, one was related to sort of historic sexual assault. And I just remember, for the first time, starting to feel a bit overwhelmed by it all. I think, my now wife sort of cottoned onto it, that I wasn't okay as such. So I do have to say, I went into work and was quite open about it. And for all the faults police get about a lot of things, I've never ever fault my line management or the police for how they supported me in that moment, in terms of like empathy and the way they supported me in terms of like what I wanted to do with work. Like, did I want to move to a different department for a while, getting access to like support services through like occupational health. Like, I would never hear a bad word in that. Obviously, people might have had different experiences, but from my experience, I would never have fought with them. And I was really pleasantly surprised how perhaps, like 5-6 years before that, when you were almost told, like, oh, keep it to yourself, like, actually, even all my colleagues, they were really supportive. Everyone reached out, and that to me showed the great side of policing, of that camaraderie and support. And so, I not that you should have any shame in revealing things like that. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think if you're around that sort of world enough, it takes a very thick-skinned person not to be affected in some way.
Yeah,
it really does. And that's encouraging to hear, because we do hear stories which are quite the opposite, where the support's not been there. And when we started, it was the same, in terms of there was an unwritten rule or a stigma attached that if you needed kind of any help or support, it was seen as a weakness, and then you might not get assigned or deployed to jobs in the same way. And I think that's really disappointing. But I feel like there's been some moves more recently with trim and some of the support. I think things are changing, but I still think there's a lot of work around it. But it's really encouraging to know that even going back that far back, you were really supported through that
Yeah,
process.
yeah. I mean, maybe I was really lucky with like line management and supervision. Maybe I
Yeah.
was. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I remember really being worried about saying anything, and all those sort of fears were sort of were never really met. It was all sort of treated with really well. I think there was that. I think the only thing I would say that I do remember sort of finding it quite hard, almost being trusted again to do things. It was almost like, oh no, and it was probably from a good place, but it was almost like, oh no, we're not gonna involve you in this because of this. It's like, well, hang on a minute, it's been quite a few months now. Like, I'm not sort of like damaged goods. Like I can.
Yeah.
But it probably came from a good place. But I do remember becoming a bit frustrated with that in some respect. But yeah, I'm aware of sort of lots of things. Like you see a lot of organisations now. Like I think there's one called Oscar Kilo, which is like a national organisation that does a lot around police well-being and stuff. So it's definitely a far different place. But and I'm sure there are sadly stories that are very different. And as I say, maybe if I'd have spoken to someone differently, it might have been treated differently. I don't know, but I can only say from my perspective,
Yeah.
it was really good.
Fantastic. Is there any one thing throughout your career that really impacted you and has stayed with you?
I think that period of time stayed with me because it probably, from that period onwards, I don't think I was never the same, but I was still me, but I had a very different outlook on terms of like well-being. And before that, I'd probably always sort of just gone along with things. Like I was a yes man, and like I think that company man, like you need a volunteer, I'll do it. And I think from that point onwards, it changed insofar as it was just a job. It pays my bills, but I'm not going to risk my health for this. I think that period of time stuck with me in that regard, in terms of outlook. In terms of a particular case, something that always stuck with me was the murder that I sort of touched earlier. I interviewed the guy who I did that interview with when I first joined, and then I ended up doing a murder interview with him as my second. That one's always stuck with me in a way because the suspect, or the guilty person, I should say, because he was convicted, was very similar age to me. And I don't know why, but he got 27, 28 years, I think it was. And it doesn't stick with me in terms of I have any feelings towards him, but I do sometimes when it's like my birthday, because he was a similar age to me. I almost think that's now 10 years, whatever. He's still in prison,
Yeah.
and because we're similar ages, and I don't know why that always sticks with me. Just because that was the first time I'd ever seen anyone sentenced to life as well. But no, nothing like circumstances of a case have ever really stuck with me. I was quite good at compartmentalizing generally those sort of things. Yeah, I'd say things like the Fishmonger Hall attack, for example, that they stick with you just because, well, it's just not normal.
Not your everyday, no.
And in
Yeah.
policing, you might deal with multiple burglaries, you might deal with multiple even homicides, for example. Very few people deal with a single terror attack. And I'd had some involvement in the Borough Market attack that happened 2 years before. So, multiple terror attacks in sort of a short space of time. I guess they stick with you to a large degree.
As a police officer, what you just mentioned compartmentalization there. What other coping mechanisms do you use? Because we've talked about it quite a lot as CSIs. And I imagine the techniques that we utilize are probably similar for a lot of people that work on the front line, but it'd just be interesting to hear your perspective.
I don't know if I had a specific thing I went through or steps I took, but I think one of the biggest things for me, was I always had something outside of policing. So I've always played sports since I was a kid. Even when I was starting the police, I still played hockey to a very good level, and then cricket as well. So I always had something outside of the police. I had, relationship. Well, I'm now married, but I had friendship groups outside the police. So I think I was always able to, Monday to Friday, I might be investigating a really bad, awful crime. But then on the Saturday, or even on Wednesday evening, I was sort of hockey training and Saturday I'd go and play a hockey match, or I'd play cricket, or would be going and doing something. And I was doing a degree while I was in the police. I always had things that I could escape to. And I think that if I would give advice to anyone, and I say this to when they talk about if they wanted maybe advice around joining the police, and staff or police officers, don't ever give up those outside interests that you have and become like solely focused on like policing great for social groups and stuff, but like I think when you police during the day and then you just go for drinks with people in the police, and like at the week, all your social groups are around policing, or you give up your sport, you give up this, you just 24/7 in that world, aren't you? So
becomes your whole life, and so easy to talk about nothing else but.
Yeah, like I've been at work for 9 hours. I'm going to go to the pub and I'm just going to talk about the police again for another 5 hours. Like, so I'm not saying you don't socialise. Because, some of my best friends are from the police I met, but I just always say don't forget that other world. And I always found that quite easy for a long time. Maybe not towards the end, but it's not so much technique. It's just, I would say, is make sure you have something outside of the police, whether that is you like playing with like building Lego or whatever it is. It's just something that is not the police. I think is a really important thing.
That's a really great piece of advice. Thank you so much. And I think that might be a good place for us to round up. We've kept you on for a really long time.
It feels like it's going for very long when you do these sort of things. You say, like, I've been talking for like an hour and a half.
It doesn't. It's flown by for us as well. It's been really fascinating talking to you, and I think we could talk to you for absolutely hours, do you, Dee?
Yeah, we could.
You're very kind.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, particularly your stuff around interviewing. I've really enjoyed learning quite a bit about that. So we've enjoyed it. I'm sure our listeners will too. So thank you very much for coming along today and giving us your time. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to another episode. We will be back in a fortnight's time where we will take you back under the barrier tape.